Old Soldiers by Neil F. Litherland. Chapter 1. The Colossus Gate was built 15 years before the conflict. 1,000,000 tons of concrete and steel made it the biggest of New Liberty's great gates, and an impressive bulwark standing between the citizens below and the threat from above. It was the twin batteries of Tempest anti-aircraft guns flanking the gate, and the ridges of 80mm Ares autocannon turrets with their barrels pointed at the skies that also made it the deadliest of these bastions. When opened to capacity, the great gates could release thousands of troops, transports, armor, and air support from subterranean hangars in minutes. In the fading gloom, it looked like the skull of a tusked dragon, blunt, ugly, and terrifying in a single-minded way. It had never been decorated or disguised to be anything other than what it was, even now that the war was over and the threat it had been built to defend against destroyed. In that way, it was just like us. The jaws of the Colossus clanked and hissed as it opened. Huge armored bulkheads slid away on rails big enough to support transport trains, pulled by massive anchor chains. Acrid air rushed into the vault, stinging my eyes and sticking in my throat. Helen coughed into her fist, her shoulders shaking from the force of her spasms. Castor snorted and spat, his eyes squeezed to slits. I clenched my teeth until my lungs stopped burning, exhaling through my nose. I tilted my head and wiped the tears off on my shoulder. "You need me to carry him for a while, Pollux?" Castor asked. I looked down at the huge shrouded bundle in my arms. I flexed my shoulders and felt the bone-deep ache that had settled into my muscles. I shook my head. "I've got him," I said. "Are we ready?" Helen asked, her voice raw as she adjusted her satchel with one hand and wiped tears from her cheeks with the other. "As ever," I said. We stepped into the ashes of the world above. Beyond the gate, stained cement and broken blacktop ran away in frozen rivers, warped and melted by constant acid rains. Stripped, rotting hulks that had once been vehicles lined the streets. Their windows were broken, and whatever paint they'd worn was long since scoured away. The skeletons of old prefab barracks buildings stood like rusting rib cages, and crippled structures whose signs and purposes had long since worn away sat like broken teeth in a rotting jaw. The sagging chain-link fence that marked the edge of the base's territory had fallen in some places and been cut away in others. Concrete overpasses arced and fell like grayscale rainbows past the fence, and beyond them stood the crumbling spires that scraped at the low-hanging sky. Lights still burned in this part of the road's district, though. The sleek, electric shells of transports sped over slender elevated tracks, and glass walls sheltered the suspended walkways that led between what few airlocked and inhabited buildings there were. This part of the city was like an old warhorse with leprosy, dying but far from dead. I walked east, passing through the growing shadow of the great gate. Castor took point 5 paces ahead to my left, and Helen, the rear guard, 5 paces behind to my right. Grit crunched under our boots, and a wet wind that tasted of sea salt and sulfur slapped our faces. Ground fog swirled around our knees, and thunder grumbled over the ocean. We'd covered one click when heat lightning rippled through the low-hanging clouds like a brainstorm, and we saw them. 5 black figures, standing at parade rest. Tall and broad, they were arrayed in a semicircle around a charred stone monument topped with a bronze torch. The torch had gutted out completely, the gas feed cut off. It had been deemed a waste for a memorial that no one was ever going to come see. "We'll fancy meeting you here," Castor said to the iron soldiers of the honor guard. Castor stepped to one side of the monument and Helen to the other. They dug their fingers beneath the lid of the huge box, straining until the heavy granite plug scraped out of its resting place. Ashes danced in the wind as they set the ton of stone lid aside. "Easy now," Helen said, pulling her satchel off over her head. She cupped one end of my bundle, and Castor took the other. All three of us lowered him until he was stretched out in the hollow interior atop the ashes of all the others we'd laid to rest in there before him. I parted the shroud, then put my hands on the lip of the false tomb as I looked down at Romulus. Shadows lived in the hollows around his eyes, and beneath the sharp crags of his cheekbones. His neck looked too frail to support his skull, and his lips were speckled with powder burns. He'd been a titan in life, but wrapped in the mortuary cloth, he looked like a child clutching a ragged blanket for comfort. A lost child who'd screamed into a gun when the world went dark around him. His eyes were open, and they stared up at me from the hole I'd laid him in. I stroked my hand over his smooth skull and reached out with my mind for the man who'd once lived inside. It was like sticking my finger in a dead power socket. Helen put her hand on my shoulder. Castor leaned his forearms on the lid to my right. "Take a breath, Pollux," he said. "You carried him a long way. We'll wait another few minutes if he has to." "He's waited long enough," I said. I stood and my back creaked. I held my hand out to Helen. "Let's send him on his way." Helen handed out the flares. We struck them, placing the burning brands in sconces once reserved for flags at the feet of the black statues. One for the gunner, who kept our fallen safe. One for the medic, who would take away their pains. One for the dispatcher, who'd send word ahead. One for the scout, who'd take point. And one for the leader, who would carry their responsibility on the journey. The statues had no faces in the black armor they wore. They had no gender either. They stood between 2.5 and 3.5 meters tall, and the details of their joints and weapons had been worn down over more than a decade of exposure to the harsh elements. The red lights of the flares flickered across the make-believe saints, breathing false life into the towering figures. In the dimness, it felt almost like the dead were stirring from their rest, like they had come back to welcome one of their own. After the flares were in place, I reached into my pocket for Romulus's unit tags. I closed my eyes and weighted them with a metal slug stamped with his name, rank, and batch number. Helen pulled on a pair of latex gloves. She removed a canister from her satchel, unscrewed the casing, and broke the seal. The Haradan 72 smelled like benzene gone rotten, and the chemical slurry poured thick as blood when she anointed Romulus with it. She tossed the canister into the pyre, along with her gloves. We stepped backward, so the statues were on one side of the stone trough, and we were on the other. Not so long ago, there would have been enough of us present at this sending off to make a complete circle. Now we did the best we could with what we had left. Castor struck the last flare. The magnesium in his burned white instead of red, creating a circle of bright light. He offered it to me, and I accepted. He nodded. Helen nodded. We faced the center, shoulders back, boot heels no more than 12 centimeters apart. "Present arms," I called. "Order arms." Helen and Castor's hands snapped to salute, and I tossed the flare. It arced through the wind, spun once, and kissed Romulus's chest. The pyre ignited with a muffled whoosh, and for a moment, Romulus was the only bright thing left in the descending twilight. Then he faded, his body sinking into itself until there was nothing more than dust in the center of a dying star. It happened fast, the flames eating everything in under a minute. I saluted, and behind us I heard the heavy impact of 7 autocannons. When the sound of the first volley had faded, they fired again, and then a third time after that. The echoes died, and the flames within the stone box died as well. A drizzling rain started falling. Helen and Castor replaced the plug, and the torch atop it sputtered for a few minutes as the last of the internal flame sought an escape from its prison. I lowered my arm, refusing to let it tremble, until it was back down at my side. We stood there for a long time, statues of flesh instead of steel, watching the fire. It would go out soon enough, and I wanted to bear witness while it still burned. The rain fell a little harder, and a grey sheet swept in from the ocean. I ignored the unpleasant kiss of the polluted water on my skin and the oncoming rush of the storm at my back. The torch burned on, and in its fading light I read the plaque affixed to the front of the memorial. Honor Guard. This memorial is dedicated to the brave Myrmidon who fell during the Hyperion War. Your sacrifices will not be forgotten as long as this flame burns. Myrmidon. The word was a designation, and we had one, just like everything else Council Research and Development had built in their secret bunkers and hidden labs when war preparations began. We'd been bathed in the living energy of hostile beings that had come from beyond the stars, helpless in our glass wombs. The essence of the Hyperion made us bigger, stronger, and let us interface with the salvaged technology of the alien race in ways no one else on our side of the conflict could. We had been the front line when the alien armada had finally descended, and we were the wall the invaders had broken against. We weren't soldiers. Soldiers volunteered. Soldiers stood because they'd made a choice. We were weapons. We were things to be used and discarded once we had served our purpose. We'd been engineered with scientists as our mothers and drill masters as our fathers. We fought like they'd taught us to, and in the end, it was the invaders who had gone down in defeat. Now we were forgotten, living relics forever marked in a world we had helped create. Castor turned up the collar on his jacket, tugging down the bill of his salvager cap as he walked over to me. Helen shook some of the smouldering raindrops from her hands, jamming them deep into her coat pockets. "Are we going to stand here and wait till it's done?" Castor asked, leaning close. I glanced from Castor to Helen. I watched the torch dance in the rain. "You have somewhere else to be?" I asked. Castor shrugged. "Not particularly. But if that little dam breaker gets biblical, they just might close the door on us." "There are other ways back in," Helen said. Castor nodded, conceding the point. Neither of them said anything for a time. The rain fell a little harder, and a klaxon sounded. I shook my head slowly, water sloshing off my hat brim every time my head changed direction. "Romulus always told us not to hold vigil after we carried Remus," I said. They nodded. "All right. No reason to keep the Dio waiting for us." We headed back on the bounce, the downpour biting hard at our heels. The outer gate was mostly closed by the time we made it back. Even so, there was room for the 3 of us abreast, and all our ghosts beside, to make our way back in. The vault doors boomed closed one after the other, and huge screws turned with sounds like the gnashing of gigantic teeth to seal them shut. The wind and rain went silent behind us as we entered the decontamination chamber. Chem mists fogged from shiny nozzles, and fans sucked out all the outside air. Purified atmosphere took its place, and the outer door opened. Helen went through first, followed by Castor. I joined them a moment later. Castor reached inside his jacket and removed a black, vacuum-sealed pouch. It bulged oddly, and when he broke the seal, 3 apples spilled into his hands. They were a deep red, and the flesh looked firm and juicy. He tossed one to Helen and another to me. "Where do you keep getting these?" Helen asked. "Trade secret," Castor said, taking the fruit between his thumb and index finger, rubbing it on the inside of his wrist. He held it up and the smile fell from his voice. "To Romulus." Helen and I repeated the toast, and as one, we ate our offerings. The skin broke and the juice sprayed onto my tongue. My mouth buzzed pleasantly from the sugar, and I swallowed. We dropped the stems into a floor grate and set off for the far end of the hangar. Armor and air power loomed large on either side of the staging floor. The massive Gorgon H-45s sat in clear-cut ranks like stainless steel rocks, and behind them were the huge treads of the Goliath rail tanks. Bulky and slow, once deployed, the electromagnetic war machines would lay down a field of fire that would take a heavy toll on any ground force foolish enough to charge the gate. Sleek Artemis-class fighters hung in suspended harnesses like sleeping falcons, and the burnished hides of Argo armored personnel carriers glistened in their loading bays. Isolated troops of grease monkeys and nutbusters crawled over the mechanized monsters, checking fluid levels, testing engines, and making sure that in the unlikely event the beasts needed to be roused, that they'd come out with guns blazing. Most of the techs kept their eyes on their work, but 1 or 2 saluted us with their smudged, stained hands. We returned the gestures, but didn't slow our pace. We passed 30 smaller side entrances to the main floor, but we didn't stop until we reached the far end of the gate. It was a choke point made up of 3 screening layers and separate doors that could be easily locked and defended in case of a breach. Soldiers in black kit with slung rifles buzzed through without a word. They nodded as we passed. We nodded back. The final gate was a steel bulkhead that would take some truly heavy ordnance to even make a dent in it. Behind a blast shield stood the gate operators, and the duty officer tasked with keeping an eye on the gate. The operators all wore the black and gold uniforms of Army regulars, and none of them stopped or stared at us as we approached. The lieutenant, an older man with bristle-brush black hair and a southern hemisphere complexion who stood around 1.8 meters tall, stepped out from behind the shield. He clicked his heels and snapped a crisp salute, tilting his head back so he was looking at our faces instead of our abdomens. "Major Pollux," the duty captain said. "Captain Castor, Captain Ellen." "We're still retired, Lieutenant Waller," I said, returning the gesture. "At ease. Did anything happen while we were off-site?" "Quiet as the... Everything was quiet, sir." "That's good to hear," I said, as if I hadn't heard the sudden change of direction in his speech. "I heard the cannons firing." Waller didn't smile, but his dark eyes glittered. "Weapons test, sir. It was rescheduled to this evening." "And the drones will be patrolling the area as usual?" Helen asked. Waller nodded. "They were late getting into the air, sir. Unavoidable technical difficulties. Hopefully nothing which would violate regulation happened out there while our eyes were closed." "That would be a shame," Castor said, the corners of his mouth practically twitching as he fought a smile. I nodded. Waller nodded. It wasn't the first time we'd done this dance. 4 years ago, the tribunal handed down ordinances forbidding certain practices when it came to the disposition of remains, particularly regarding the bodies of Myrmidon. There were still those in the ranks who believed a soldier's death should be honored, though, regardless of what the brass had to say about the peculiarities of the ritual involved. Helen, Castor, and I saluted. Waller returned it. "Log us out, Lieutenant," I said. "The gate is yours." "Yes, sir," Waller said, stepping back behind the shield. A moment later a buzzer sounded, and the blast doors swung open for us. Like everything else at the Colossus Gate, The access doors were larger than standard regulation size. It was meant to admit a 3-man team abreast, but the 3 of us still had to duck beneath the lintel. We did not, however, need to turn sideways. The tunnels beneath the Colossus Gate were wide, crude, and ugly. Biolights stuffed with glowing algae filled the corridors, providing serviceable light while simultaneously scrubbing the contaminants from the air. The stone had been chewed and flattened underfoot, and the corridors were large enough that small transports could make it through with room to spare. Tiny cameras scanned the tunnels, and recessed security gates could be sprung to seal a corridor and stop any threat behind a solid barricade. There were stairways and lifts every 100 meters or so, and they were both wide and functional. Interlevel access here lacked the polish and sheen seen in other parts of the city, but like everything else, that was by design. Fort Carter had been built for functionality, and nowhere was that clearer than in the shadow of the gate. We walked briskly, falling into lockstep out of childhood habit. We kept to the center of the corridor, where the arch was highest, ducking beneath structural braces and the unlit emergency lamps. We passed subfloor motor pools where problematic vehicles were being stripped and drained, along with gate barracks where the change of shift did their 2 weeks of waiting for something to happen. The rec rooms were spaced out, filled to capacity with every set of off-duty boots who weren't sleeping. Soldiers played games, shuffled hands of cards, or crashed out on couches with the latest text releases. Most of the others sat in tight clusters, absorbed in vid screens playing everything from news clips to music casts. I reflected that the rough-carved caves had been squared off since the old days, and the walls were now covered in colourful paint instead of being left hard and bare. The old wartime furnishings had been replaced by smooth, padded things that looked comfortable but impractical. I shook my head, put my hands in my pockets, and kept walking. "Do you think they feel it?" I asked the back of Helen's head. "Hard not to," Castor said, rapping his knuckles on a beam as he passed under it. The knock rang dully, like a striker hitting the side of a busted bell. "All that weight over their heads?" "I don't think that's what he meant," Helen said. Castor shrugged one shoulder and stopped in front of the freight elevator we'd originally ridden up in. He punched an access code into the pad, using his little finger to avoid mashing the wrong keys. The pad beeped its acceptance, and the car rose. "If I had to take a guess, I'd say some do," Castor said, leaning his shoulder on the wall and folding his arms while he waited. "The ones reading books in their bunks by themselves, probably. For most of them, though, this is just a cushy 2-week rotation, one where they get to stare out at nothing for a watch, play with big guns, and catch a break from PT." I nodded, but didn't say anything. The car arrived, and the grille drew back. I stepped in first, followed by Helen. Castor got into the lift last, punching in the code for our destination. It was a close fit in the car, but nowhere near as intimate as it had been when we had Romulus with us. I squeezed my temples between the thumb and forefinger of my left hand. "You need something for that?" Castor asked, idly spitting an apple seed out through the lift's skeletal wall. It smacked the stone and bounced down into darkness. "No," I said, shaking my head slightly. "Not yet." Castor nodded, shucking his cap and running a hand through his thin white hair. Helen leaned against the rear brace, stretching her neck left and right until it popped loudly. I squeezed my head, not sure if I was trying to make the pain go away, or if I wanted to make it worse. The car stopped, opening up in the rear corner of the sub-level 6 vehicle storage garage. The space reeked of methane and petrol, and the thick, greasy aroma that clung to machine parts no matter how often maintenance was performed on them. A flatbed rumbled past us toward the exit, and a battery-driven gear hauler following along behind like a squire would his knight. Neither vehicle slowed as we stepped out of the car, and made our way toward the south wall where Castor had parked his temporarily borrowed Salvager V-72 transport rig.
"Anyone up for a night out?"
Castor asked, tugging his keys off his belt and idly spinning the ring around his finger.
"I've got an early shift at the orchard," Helen said. "If I'm going to be even 50%, I need to go down soon." "I shall refrain from suggesting it would be easy for you to go down," Castor said.
He turned to me, eyebrows raised.
"How about it? The junkyard's no more than half an hour out from the tower, and the first drink's on me."
I shook my head once. "Got somewhere to be tonight?"
"Is that so?"
he asked, head tilting slightly.
"Heading down to the jungle?"
"Yep."
"Rough borough."
"It is."
"Didn't you get shot there a few months ago?"
Castor asked. "Shot at," I corrected. "I could hold your hand if you're scared."
"Too much action for me,"
Castor said, dropping me a wink. He turned, unlocked the door, and hauled himself up into the cab. A moment later, the rear doors opened on hydraulic wings, and Helen and I clambered into the back. We each took up 2 of the 6 jump seats, but other than that, we fit just fine. Helen slapped the rear wall of the cargo bay twice, and the engine grumbled to life. The rear doors closed and latched themselves into place. Castor reversed into the aisle, shifted gears, and started the low, slow trek home. Even from the back of the hauler, I could track our progress. We angled up to the main traffic roads on the 2nd level, and Castor turned north. The road was wide, sturdy, and had been designed for transporting equipment far heavier than the hauler we were using. Traffic was thick but flowing, made up of a combination of base-only vehicles carrying on-duty personnel and civilian vehicles that were likely heading off base after the workday. Castor kept his speed within regulation limits, much to the irritation of some of the other drivers. I closed my eyes, but the dark place in the center of my head wasn't the retreat as it usually was. It felt too close in there, the mental walls more like the blocks of a cell than the comforting confines of a den. Helen touched my knee, and I looked up. "Something wrong?" I asked, noticing we weren't moving.
"You went away," she said.
I blinked several times and worked my tongue around in my mouth. I was parched, and I coughed when I tried to swallow. I took a deep breath and held it. I worked my jaw and flexed my fingers. I had pins and needles. I frowned, focusing on them until they went away. "Where are we?" I asked.
"The low-way exit, waiting on inspection."
I nodded. Wherever it was I went when my synapses glitched. I hadn't been there very long this time. I sat up straighter and held Helen's gaze. She looked into my eyes, checking to be sure I was clear, alert and focused. The line moved forward, the squawk boxes above our heads crackled, and Castor's voice came out in a stereo warble. "We're up next, kids," he said. "Standard sweep and wave. If they ask for ID, just hand it to them." I snorted. Helen sighed. Between the banners and parades, the marches, speeches, and hours of video footage of our training programs, there was no one in the city who couldn't recognize us on sight. Even if they didn't know our names, it was difficult to miss someone who usually stood a meter or more above the rest of the crowd, and who displayed marked oculocutaneous albinism. We both settled in to wait, backs against the wall and hands in plain view on our knees. It took the team outside 2 minutes to complete the exterior sweep. I heard the muffled voice of the squad leader, and while I couldn't hear his exact words, I done the drill often enough to fill them in. There was a rap on the back doors, and then the buzzer as Castor flicked the opening switch. They stood equidistant from one another, holding their weapons ready, but with the barrels pointed down and away. Each had a bulky flak jacket on, but their ranks were displayed prominently on their collars and shoulders. "Everything all right, Lance Corporal?" I asked, addressing the stocky figure in the center.
Yes, sir, she said, her voice nasal through her face guard. She slung her weapon and saluted. The other two followed suit. Helen nodded to them. The doors closed again, latching themselves in place again. The same muffled voice said one last thing to Castor. The engine cleared its throat, and we rumbled over the threshold to the world of civilian life. Helen sighed, massaging the back of her neck. I sat quietly, focusing on my hands so that they stayed firmly rooted in the here and now. It didn't take long to get where we were going once we were off base. The hauler picked up speed as we hit the lowway, swaying as Castor switched lanes and took the occasional access loop he was supposed to stay out of when he wasn't on official business. It took roughly half an hour until the nose pointed downward, and the air brakes took hold. The speakers crackled just as we shuddered to a full stop. "Helios Tower, now disembarking," Castor said, his tone round and jovial. "All your needs with none of your wants." I popped open the rear doors and stepped out. The transport was stopped in front of the tower's southern bank of sub-level doors, up against the curb and still taking up most of the road. A few cabs idled, waiting on fares, and a short line filled the cul-de-sac. No one honked their horns, though a tiny transport made a run for the sun and nearly kissed the back of the trailer as it slid on past with two of its wheels on the opposite gutter. Some of the foot traffic stopped to stare, but not much. This was where we lived, and even people who didn't share the residence with us knew that. Helen and I closed up the doors, checked the street, and stepped around to the driver's side. Castor had the window down and was turned as much as the cab space would allow to look out. "You're really going to make me drink alone tonight?" he asked. "We'll find a day," I said, offering my hand. "Have one for me." "Not tonight," Castor said, taking my hand. "I'm drinking to remember, not to forget." Helen put her hand over ours, and we held the tableau for a moment. Castor pulled away and shifted gears. He checked both his mirrors and headed back toward the lowway. Helen and I waded through the trailer's exhaust, stepping onto the curb as the traffic flow started up again. "Do you think he'll be all right?" Helen asked. I shrugged. "He always has been before." She nodded, running a hand through the platinum spiderwebs of her hair. I kept walking, waiting for her to get to what was really on her mind. "What's your ETA for Babylon proper?" "I don't have to be there for a few hours," I said. "Would you be willing to come by my quarters?" "Your quarters are right next door," I said. "I have to walk past you before I leave." "I know the building's layout," she said. "I was looking for a yes or no." I took off my hat and shook the last few droplets of rain off the brim. The caustic water tingled as it touched my fingertips. I ran my palm back over my bare scalp, and when I tried to swallow, there was a tightness in my throat. Helen took my hand, and I felt a slight spark as what lived inside her reached for what lived inside me. I put my hat back on and squeezed her hand. "Yes," I said. Chapter 2. The sensation was like waking from sleep and into a face full of winter wind. I was flying, I was falling, and I didn't know which way was up. My pulse was sedate, my mind was on fire, and I felt like I'd just been born. I was fresh and new, but something deep inside I'd taken for granted had been severed in order to turn we back into me. I smelled ozone, and I tasted tears. Merging was like grief. Sometimes you needed it, even if you didn't want it. "Was I crying?" Helen asked, reaching up to touch her face. "Yeah," I said. I rubbed my face with my right hand, and it came away damp. "Me too." "At least neither of us threw up this time," she said. I nodded slightly. then thought better of it. We lay on her sleeping mat for several minutes, each taking long breaths and swallowing as the bedroom swam back into focus around us. My muscles were watery, and my heart rate was too low. My mouth tasted like a dry cell battery. My throat clicked when I tried to swallow. I moved my left foot rhythmically, a simple trigger for getting a tighter hold on myself during the free-fall period that came before and after a session where I pooled my consciousness with someone else's. I made my left hand let go of Helen's right, and the skin peeled away from the connection point. "Status?" she asked. "I feel like the breech end of a blown barrel," I said, examining how many layers of skin I'd lost on my left palm. I stopped bouncing my foot and let out a long, slow breath. "I'll live. You?" "I have a firing range behind my eyes, and my tongue tastes like latrine duty," she said. "How long were we under?" I closed my eyes and looked for an answer. Sense of time was the first thing to go during a merge. The past and present were jumbled up, leaving everything bare, open and intense. It was a pooling of thoughts and feelings until there was no separation left between those involved. There was no beginning, no end, just a seamless, liquid whole of experiences. I knew what she knew, and she knew what I knew. It was intimate beyond description, and it offered comfort, understanding, and a blissful end too, for a brief time. It was one of our mysteries the men in white coats had desperately wanted to solve. But the why of merging had never much mattered to us. We could do it, so we did. "Judging from my hand, I'd guess about 45 minutes, I said, glancing at the far table where the old-fashioned alarm had been set up to pull us back from ourselves. Its rhythmic ticking had ceased, and the metal hands had drawn together to point in the same direction. "I don't think the clock was out of the spark zone." Helen groaned and rolled onto her side. I watched the muscles in her back as she stood and made herself stretch. Long, lean, and graceful, she knew where every part of her was in relation to every other part. She was naked, her pale skin showing flashes of blue veins underneath. I closed my eyes and focused on the electromagnetic thrum of her heart. It beat in time with mine for another few moments, but then my pulse started back into its regular rhythm. We were well and truly separate again. "Get up, Pollux," Helen said. "Let me look you over." I opened my eyes and got up. It took me longer than it normally would have, but I managed it without stumbling. I stretched my fingers, my arms, my back, and my legs, checking for any muscle or tendon damages. I paid particular attention to my balance, and I made sure nothing felt torn or pulled. The more of us there were in a merge, the less strain there was on every individual body, but with only the two of us we couldn't afford to stay linked for long before our anatomy started eating itself. Helen looked me over, digging her thumbs into the back of my neck, the hollows of my wrists, and the backs of my knees. Finally, she stood and hooked her sparse mane behind her ears. "Anything?" I asked. "Not a hair out of place," she said, cracking a tired smile at the old joke. I rubbed my cheeks and chin, my eyebrows, and my skull. They were smooth as the day I'd been born, just like the rest of me. Helen leaned her forehead against mine and closed her eyes. Her thoughts hummed against my brow like a reactor behind a buckling shield. "Your nightmare came back." "Yes." "Do you think it's because you went off your meds?" I shrugged. The dream came, whether I was on them or not. "What does it mean?" I thought of the dream. The empty blasted field and the tunnel of armored warriors standing still and silent. Soldiers of death,
waiting for me to walk among them to take my place at the end of the line. I worked my jaw and sighed. I don't know, Hel. I really don't know. Helen nodded, and her nose bumped against mine. The remnants of a tear dripped and ran across my lips. I couldn't tell if it was hers or mine.
We're getting dark.
But we aren't black yet, I said, cupping the back of her neck and squeezing gently.
Not yet,
she agreed. She squeezed me back, then let go.
Get us a drink, will you? I've got cider in the fridge.
I padded to her kitchen and opened her fridge. 2 industrial jugs of cider stood side by side on the bottom of the shelf, seals intact. I checked the expiration dates, saw they were the same, and broke open the jug on the left. I poured half a measure of the sharp-scented mash into 2 glasses and replaced the container. I stepped back into the bedroom and handed her a glass. She clinked it against my own.
To those who were, Helen said.
To those who are left, I replied. We drank. Helen shivered as the cold concoction slid down her gullet. She set her glass on top of her chest of drawers and sat down hard on her sleeping mat. She raked one hand through her hair and bit her bottom lip hard enough that bright blood rushed to the surface. You going to be all right? I asked. Helen nodded slowly, never opening her eyes.
Just shadows and dust between my ears. I'll have another glass, chase it with a Z-tab, and be me again by the time I have to leave for my shift. Go see your girl. I'll be fine.
I smiled at the mention of my girl. You sure?
Yes, I'm sure, she said.
You'll call?
If I need to, she said,
shooing me off with one hand.
Go on. You told her you'd be there tonight, and if you wait any longer, you won't be able to make it.
I poured each of us another glass before I got dressed. I stepped into the hall and walked the 8 paces between her quarters and mine. I pressed my thumb against the wall scanner. The door clicked open, and the lights dialed up at the first sign of movement. A low chime hummed along the rafters to announce my entrance. I took 2 steps across the threshold, and an old memory popped up in my brain like a bubble on the surface of a tar pit. A shouted command, barely heard over the roar of gunfire, and the exultation that always came with a perfect headshot on one of the moving target dummies. I shook my head slowly, gritting my teeth until the ghost drifted past. Therapeutic as merging could be, it left a mess in your head. It dumped out all the memories everyone had and stirred them into a slurry. But when you finally unplugged, it left all your wires crossed. My head would sort itself out, given time, and a long night's sleep, but sometimes I'd touch a live wire, and the current ran through me. The invasive thoughts, the stolen memories, were echoes. Some of them were mild, some of them weren't. The worst part was, it was even odds which kind was coming to visit once you disconnected. I made my way to the bathroom and popped open the medicine cabinet. I cleared off the top shelf and reached up under the lip until I found the small tin held in place with a magnet. I popped the lid, then shook 3 tiny brown discs into my palm. I put one in my mouth, swallowed, then put the other 2 away again. I took deep, slow breaths. I drank 2 glasses of water and relieved myself. I checked my wall terminal for any messages. There were none. No real surprise there. I logged out, closed the terminal, flicked the light panel, and left. The hallways in the top floors of the Helios Tower were straight and wide, with arched ceilings that would have been decorative in any other building. The carpet was thin, the paint was drab, and the doors each had 1 letter and 1 number to identify them. Most of those doors had been closed for years, but echo still resounded as I passed them. The hot rush of pleasure as Cassandra finished decorating the first personnel quarters she'd ever had. The numb ache where Melas's right arm ended and the mangled stump began. The long night's pleasure as Electra listened to the rain. Nyx curled up next to her as music played in the dark. The quiet calm of Ajax's morning meditations in a place where no unwanted noise intruded. The stink of sweat and cheap wine as Hector struggled to find meaning in a life without a command structure. On and on they came, familiar spectres who wanted to be remembered. Between the chlorpromazine and the cider, though, they were just shades. I heard them moan, but they were toothless, far-off things, little more than the dreams you had in dreams. I thumbed the button for the lift and looked at the vid screen at the end of the hall. It showed a high-definition camera feed of the outside world, an illusion meant to distract people from the fact that every inhabited building was airtight and sealed. Even on the top 3 floors of Helios Tower, one of the biggest hubs in the northeast section of the Rhodes district, there wasn't a single functional window. It was like the tower had been drawn whole out of the earth and hollowed out, the residents inside living and working like ants. The image never failed to make me smile, but the expression had grown bitter over the years. The car came and shuttled me down the anthill. The main lobby was an open-air atrium, tiled in mismatched checkerboard and polished to a parade shine. Squat pillars supported a mezzanine balcony, and shops did a brisk business beneath the overhang. Public access terminals buzzed with the day's happenings, and the clock hanging above the splashing fountain chimed the hour. Dozens of locals browsed the goods, and perhaps 3 times as many tourists lounged at tables on benches, eating, conversing, or just passing through on their way to other parts of the 3-block structure. Signs pointed the way toward neighboring complexes, and stairways led up to enclosed walking tubes or down to the lowway, where residents could access vehicle storage or catch a cab or bus as needed. I walked slowly, rolling my steps from my heels to the balls of my feet. I kept my head down and buried my hands in my coat pockets. I made no sudden movements. Clarice and her cleaning crew leaned on their mops and waved at me, their tangled hair tucked under kerchiefs, their faces damp with sweat. Abimand caught my eye over his newspaper from behind his counter, and his beard split into a toothy grin. His assistant looked up, and the younger man gave me a solemn nod. A pair of boys I didn't know gaped at me, while the man chaperoning them tried not to do the same. I nodded to each of them in turn, and kept moving forward. I walked past the fountain, where the clean smell of tumbling water covered up the scents of buffing wax and oily foods left too long on dirty grills. I felt phantom grease on my hands as somewhere in my memory I slid the firing pin from a Griffin 72 cannon mount, looking for a flaw in the mechanism. Another dozen strides brought me to the edge of the central crossbreeze, where I had to lean around hanging signs and ford the stream of foot traffic. I remember the feeling of date wine splashing across my tongue, and I heard the last few bars of a battle hymn echoing off stone chambers carved deep into a mountainside base. 30 steps took me out the main doors and into the double-decker shell of the train station. I fed credits into a machine until it spit out a ticket. I checked to be sure I'd bought the right one, then trudged up the stairs. There were people waiting on the platform, though not as many at this time of night. A mother with one child at her hip and another in her arms stood near the far end of the concrete dock. A grey-haired man in spider-silk overalls with grease stains in the skin of his knuckles leaned against a support post, speaking to 2 younger men dressed in the same work clothes. A woman in a damp standard-issue slicker and the ugly square-toed shoes of the engineering corps sat on one of a dozen benches next to a boy in a flap jacket who probably wasn't old enough to ride the rail without a guardian.
No one said anything, but there was a hiccup in conversation when I entered. A skipped beat you couldn't miss if you knew how to listen for it. I found a place to stand where my head wouldn't hit the support beams, and I listened to the storm outside. In my head, memories chased each other like raindrops across a window. A wind from a lifetime ago buffeted me as I dropped over the African coast, and I heard a whispered thought that it was more like flying than falling. A nurse jabbed a probe into my deltoid and took readings while she asked me questions that didn't seem relevant to anything. The weight of medals and commendations dragging on my uniform tunic. They seemed so much heavier than the weapons I'd carry to earn them. The echoes came and went, whispering like waves as they slid back out to sea on an ebb tide of memory. Behind me, a big man in dungarees and a plastiche leather jacket with armor weave in the elbows and shoulders mounted the stairs. The strut stuttered out of his steps when he saw me, and he edged away down the platform as if that had been his goal all along. A young woman with copper curls and corrective lenses bumped into me as she tried to walk and read her hand terminal at the same time. When she looked up to apologize, she realized she was staring at my hip and tilted her head back even further. I nodded to her, and she took a seat on one of the benches without saying anything. 12 more people came up the stairs, and 4 of them decided to wait for the next transport. 3 of them stared at me like I was a zoo exhibit who jumped the fence. 15 minutes later, the airlock opened and let the train in. The High Line Express swooped into the station like a predator with air brakes. A stainless steel Raptor, the front of the train bore a spiked beak that swept back into a sleek, 10-car body etched with drag-reducing plumage. Compressed air jets blew it dry, and it steamed for a long moment before the doors opened and disgorged the passengers. Officers and laborers, clerical workers and students, they were universally tired, worn, and footsore. They disembarked on the far side of the tracks, and the near doors opened a few moments later to allow new passengers inside. I waited until the first car was empty, then bent, scanned my ticket, and shuffled awkwardly to the rear-facing front seat just to the left of the fire door. The engineer announced there would be no further stops in the roads district and read off the estimated times for the next 3 stations once we'd crossed over into the gardens district. The young woman in glasses approached the lead car, hesitated, then entered. She sat in the front forward-facing bench on the opposite side of the carriage and tapped her screen several times with her forefinger. The doors were beginning to close when the man in the petrochemical jacket slid inside as well. He flopped onto a bench halfway up the cabin just as the doors vacuum-sealed and the train's forward motion began. The High Line soared over the tracks barreling through the broken city. Glass breezeways whipped by like glowing veins in the darkness, and below us the gutters swirled with brackish runoff. The black bulk of ferries plied the channel, and the halogen eyes of scrapper transports flitted along the streets like feral dogs, hunting for treasure in the trash. Lightning crashed, throwing everything into stark, simple detail for a moment, before it all faded back into gloom. Thunder stumbled after it, lost in the blackness of the sky. I drummed my fingers on my left knee, moving from thumb to little finger, and then back to the beginning. It was a nervous habit, and all the worse for not even being one of my own. I hoped it would fade along with the other echoes. The train curved north, skipping over the water before arcing around the bay on a northeastern bearing. Dark waves churned beneath dark storm clouds, and it was impossible to tell where the sky ended and the water began. I counted the mile markers and peered into the maelstrom. A shadow that was little more than a silhouette stood far out in the water. I focused on it, straining my eyes so I wouldn't lose the location. Lightning flashed again, and I saw her. She stood on a crumbling island surrounded by the rising tide. Her skin was pitted with grime, and her robes worn to ribbons around her sandaled feet. The spokes of her crown had eroded, and one arm lay broken on the ground like a sacrifice to the gods of the old world. She held the shards of a gutted torch aloft in her remaining hand, her streaked face staring out toward the ocean. There was a dignity in her refusal to bend, even though she'd been broken, and it sent a chill through me every time I saw her. I looked away from the window and glanced at the wave view embedded behind shatter-resistant polycarbonate in the car's upper wall. An attractive woman of indeterminate age and mixed ancestry was talking about steel shortages and how the Civil Service Bureau was attempting to recruit more salvagers and technicians to increase both the intake and the output from construction crews in an effort to deal with burgeoning population growth. High Market was experiencing atmospheric leakages, as well as a drop in air quality, but resources to fix it were scarce. Residents were encouraged to stay inside, and where that wasn't possible, to take protective measures to minimize their exposure. There were no food shortages, or at least that was the official line, and academy graduation rates were up 5%. There was talk of General Joseph Rand stepping down from the tribunal, and likely candidates for replacement seemed to be a topic of conversation. General Harold Blake was a popular contender, and the way the newscasters talked about him, it was as if he might represent a changing of the guard from those who fought in the conflict to those who were tasked with rebuilding the world now that it was over. I tuned it out, letting the words wash over me without letting them in. From the corner of my eye, I noticed the redhead glancing my way. Every time she looked at me, the thumb and forefinger of her right hand plucked at a balding place on her left sleeve. Her lips parted twice, but she turned away without saying anything. I pretended I didn't notice, keeping my eyes on the screen and letting my gaze drift to the middle distance. The man watched her try not to watch me, and his face grew more and more sour the longer the charade went on. I noted that, and gathered my feet under me. The lugs stood up as the train cut east over the stretch of water between the mainland and the island that was the Gardens District. He tucked his right thumb behind his belt and held onto the support pole with his left hand. Once he had his balance, he sauntered up the aisle.
"You X-ray him any harder, Sunnyside. The tank's gonna get cancer," he smirked as he walked, pushing his chest out and keeping his stance wide.
Part of it was likely for balance, but it was mostly to fill as much space with his body and his presence as he could. The woman blanched, drawing in on herself as if avoiding a blow. The man leaned against the pole supporting her seat, leering down at the top of her head. The edges of a black tattoo crept up his neck, but I couldn't make out the pattern to see if it was a decoration or a gang brand.
"Seems big man ain't pigging you back. Ain't no reason to be a missed connection, though, if he don't want to be."
She said nothing, but her breathing ticked up a notch, like she was getting ready to run. He stepped in front of her, exaggerating the sway of the train with his hips. Her lips thinned, pressing her mouth into a bare line.
"You need a plug and play, that's all. Pretty thing like you, got no need to go to the zoo for it."
I took off my hat and set it on the seat next to me. He caught the movement and looked my way, the smirk blossoming into a full-sized sneer as he gripped his crotch with a meaty hand.
"Maybe this is what you're browsing for, eh?" he said to me, clacking his teeth. "That what you like, Tank?"
"Go away," the young woman said.
"What's that static?"
The man swiveled his face back to her, and his voice lost its teasing veneer. He leaned down, close enough to kiss.
"You mind resending that?"
"She said go away," I told the lank, greasy hair on the back of his head. "I'd listen to her, were I you."
"Else what happens?"
he asked, yanking a weapon out of his rear waistband and pointing it obliquely in my direction. It was a snub-nosed little zip gun, a cheap prefab model that looked more like a toy than a weapon. It held a half-dozen rounds. It was bored for a 5.5mm shell with a hand-measured powder load.
"You're just a big gun with no armor topside."
A chain of memories exploded like synaptic firecrackers. A dropped weapon spitting a burst of flak into the air as mechanical monstrosities swarmed over the walls. The angry roar of a mob vomiting from an alley, waving fists and firebrands. A sneering young prostitute turning his back on credit chips, the whine of an engine as a driver went faster instead of slowing down, and the taste of a gun barrel still slick from a recent clearing. None of them were mine, but all of them were in my head, blotting out thought. I snatched the gunman's wrist, jerking his hand offline and pulling him close. His finger convulsed twice around the trigger, and the slide jammed down a half-ejected shell. I twisted sharply, and his wrist snapped like a chicken bone. I kicked his shin and backhanded him as he fell. His teeth snapped together, and his cheekbone fractured. I pulled the gun out of his nerveless fingers and let him finish falling. I prodded my chest until I found the impact site. I plucked 2 flattened slugs out the quad-weaved para-aramid fibers on my coat and examined the rough patches they'd left behind. The fabric wasn't rated for ballistics protection, but it had been specifically designed to survive the wear and tear of my daily life. The weave would stand up to more than the little heater the street scrub was packing, and I'd known that as soon as I saw the bulge in his jacket. I probed beneath my coat and felt fresh bruises along my ribs. No penetration and no blood. The marks on my skin would fade quickly enough. I thumbed the ejector on the weapon, removed the clip, then racked the slide to dislodge the jammed shell. I removed the cartridges, put them in my coat pocket, and stripped the gun until it was just a pile of parts. By the time I'd finished, the flashbulbs in my head had gone dark, and I was mostly myself again. The big man tried to get up, swaying as he clutched his mangled wrist to his chest. "You get off at the next stop," I said, speaking slowly and clearly. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out right. So instead, he spit a mouthful of blood at my feet and added a hand gesture for edification. I watched his hand to make sure he didn't try for another weapon and waited for the pain of the injury to really take hold. He lasted about 15 seconds before his adrenaline reserve went dry and the shakes started. He wasn't going into shock, but all the feel-good spurts that kept pain at bay had cycled through. He fell over, almost landing in the spatter of blood on the floor next to my boot. The train slowed, coming into the canal station. The pressure jets dried the express. The doors hissed open, and I picked up the tattooed bully boy by his collar. I gave him a gentle shove down the aisle, and he shuffled onto the platform without a backward glance. He melted into the crowd, catching no more than 3 or 4 stares before the commuters forgot they'd even seen him. People got into the other cars, but no one joined us up front. The doors closed, and the train took off again. I picked up the stripped-down weapon and put the pieces in my pocket. We rode in silence for a time, the train rocking slightly as it accelerated. My railway companion went back to picking at her sleeve and watching me out of her peripheral vision. The wave view switched to a report on the air reclamation project, claiming that the atmospheric damage done during the conflict was indeed being reduced. The reporter parroted the numbers, but it would still be decades before we were likely to get anything like a sunny day through the chemical clouds weapons like the Erebus warheads had injected into the sky. There were empty noises about the successes other cities were experiencing, and the usual statements about uniformity from the world's remaining readouts. The reporter sounded like she was trying to believe it, even as she signed off. The intercom buzzed, and the engineer announced the next stop at 72nd Street. The train slowed and slid onto another track. The airlock opened, and the High Line chuffed its way inside. The jets blew, and the rain drained away. I glanced out the window. Creepers and vines twisted from the station's eaves like living nooses, sweat dripping from their bitter ends in the warmth. Brass birds sang tinny tunes from the gilded rails, and the floor was a mosaic of greens nature had never intended nor condoned. The benches were actual wood, and algal lamps cast emerald light at regular intervals. They brightened as the train approached, pushing the platform's shadows back into the corners as they tried to purify the newly acquired atmosphere. "Babylon Station, Platform 7, the engineer said, as the seals popped and the doors slid open. I put my hat back on and stood awkwardly, bent nearly double as I shuffled out the door. The crowd parted around me, but most were too intent on boarding or disembarking to gawk. Gardeners were jaded, and to them I was just another sight to see. I repaid their indifference in kind as I stood on the platform and took internal inventory. Every major muscle group ached, but like the echoes, the aches felt dull and fuzzy around the edges. I stretched, but nothing cried out when I did. My mouth was dry and tasted like metal. I flexed my fingers, my neck, and my jaw as I waited for the last shakes of the adrenaline spike from earlier to pass. All around me people got on and people got off. They moved in eddies and currents that had no real rhyme or reason to them. Commuters checked their terminals, glanced at schedule screens, and adjusted cheap filter masks or resettled satchel straps. Someone tapped my elbow. I twitched, but when I turned around, the young woman with the red curls was looking up at me. "Yes?" I asked. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry," she said. "You're sorry?" I heard about what happened," she said. "Romulus," I said. She nodded and tried to smile. It was a little nervous and more than a little bent around the corners, but there was sincere effort in it. "I saw it on the news a few days ago, and I wanted to let you know someone cared." "Thank you," I nodded, and after a long moment managed to get out, "That's kind of you to say." "No, thank you," she said. She tried to say something else, but it wouldn't come. I nodded again to let her know I understood. She stuck out her right hand. "My name's Melissa." "Pollux." I extended my hand. She touched her palm to the inside of my wrist, and I did my best to return the gesture. She pressed her skin to mine for a long moment, then broke the contact. I fished the flattened slugs out of my pocket and held them out to her. "What's this for?" she asked, tentatively cupping her hands. "A souvenir." I gave her the best smile I had left, dropping the 2 crushed metal discs into her hands. The loudspeaker announced a final boarding for the express, and Melissa glanced over her shoulder. I have to go," she said. "Thank you, again." She stepped back into the front car just as the doors hissed closed. Melissa grabbed an overhead bar and looked out the window at me. I nodded to her as the train revved its engine and the far side of the airlock opened. The train surged back into the storm. I watched until it was gone and the lock irised closed behind its departing lights. I stood there for a long moment, trying to savor the good deed, as well as the temporary quiet between my ears it had brought. When the warmth on my wrist had faded to a memory, I walked through the station. I tossed my ticket into the collection bin and deposited one piece of the confiscated pocket pistol into each trash can I passed. Feeling a little lighter, I took the stairs down to the arcade. That was the first 2 chapters of Old Soldiers, a book by Neil F. Litherland. If you'd like to read the whole work, you can find it via the link in the description. Thanks for listening.